Windows Vista. It was hyped as the glossy, shimmering future of computing, but turned into a digital punchline.
You were pointing out Vista's flaws, cancel or allow?
Allow.
Vista arrived 3 years late after a hellish development cycle and became infamous for sluggish performance, driver crashes, and obnoxious security alerts. It's been 18 years now since Vista launched, and if you remember powering on your wheezy old Dell Dimension to the chorus of this iconic startup sound, then you, like me, probably look back on Vista with at least a twinge of nostalgia. 2007 feels like a very long time ago, and yet still oddly connected to the present. The iPhone was a thing, though only just. The social media boom was well underway, but at the same time, it was only a decade removed from the PC boom of the 1990s, when Windows looked like this and ran on these. That's the world Windows Vista crash-landed into in January of that year. So in our deep dive on this often misunderstood piece of software, we're going to dig into how Vista became Vista, the legacy of the OS, and whether it really deserves the derision it's faced over the years. Let's jump in. What became Windows Vista started out as Windows codename Longhorn following Windows XP's launch in late 2001. And the original plan was for a much more modest upgrade to XP, think Windows 95 to 98 rather than a full reinvention. The Longhorn name came from a bar located between two ski resorts frequented by Microsoft engineers, Whistler and Blackcomb. Whistler was Windows XP's codename, and Blackcomb would be the next major version after that. So you get the idea, Windows Longhorn was a stepping stone between XP and the next big thing. More than 60 distinct pre-release builds of Longhorn have leaked since development started more than 2 decades ago, giving us a fascinating roadmap through shifting design languages, experimental features, and wildly varying levels of stability. That's because although Longhorn started out as a minor update, feature creep soon set in. More stuff that had been planned for Blackcomb fell back onto Longhorn. An ambitious new relational file system, WinFS, that worked more like a database, a bold new 3D translucent interface powered by Avalon, a new UI framework, and an overhaul of Windows security and communications codenamed Indigo. And a big reason both for Longhorn's delay and that gradual feature creep was the security catastrophe that Windows XP turned into shortly after launch. XP was well received, but it suffered a string of high-profile security scares in its first year, leading to Microsoft hitting the brakes on Longhorn, pulling engineers off that project to fight XP's growing security crisis. The security of 2001-era XP was so bad that in 2024, YouTuber Eric Parker opened up an unpatched XP virtual machine to the internet, and it was compromised within minutes. Yikes. That's what Microsoft's engineers were up against, so no wonder work on Longhorn slowed, and its original target release date of 2003 quickly became unrealistic. Early XP's insecurity, it seems, was the result of sloppy, rushed coding. Way back in 2000, the Windows codebase was split following executive disagreements over the level of polish that was necessary in the consumer version of Windows. Basically, did a lowly home PC really need that level of security and reliability? XP, on the consumer side, was essentially rushed to market in a year and a half. On the server side, the team behind Windows Server 2003 fixed more bugs and secured more of their code, taking twice as long but building a product that was much more secure and reliable. There's a great interview between Dave Cutler, who worked on Windows Server, and programmer turned YouTuber Dave Plummer that I'll link to in the description if you want to dive deeper on the split between XP and Windows Server. Anyway, in 2002, Longhorn was being built on top of that inferior XP codebase with all its instabilities and bugs. At the same time, the Longhorn team, led by VP of Platforms Jim Olchin, continued to prioritize flashy features over stability and reliability. That's something you can see through many of the leaked builds that came to light in 2003. In some places you see hints of what eventually arrived in Vista, like the widget sidebar here, but elsewhere it's often a fever dream of broken features and wildly diverging UI styles, bringing in visuals that have a pretty cringy early 2000s web design feel to them. That's in stark contrast to the glitzy Longhorn concept videos that were circulating the year before. Longhorn's performance in general was also hot trash. Microsoft had aimed to rewrite all the core Windows apps using the .NET framework for improved security and stability, but this came with a big performance hit. Similar deal with WinFS, the new file system which gorged itself on system resources. The way Windows was built internally at the time also contributed to the chaos. Different teams, known as build labs, were working in silos on their own areas of the OS, things like the UI, file system, network, and graphics, before contributing their code back to the main branch. As ambitions grew and feature creep kept on creeping, Longhorn development increasingly was like a bunch of blindfolded people building a Jenga tower, each with their own idea of how it should look. Daily Longhorn builds based on the latest code would often be completely unusable or even fail to boot, according to Dave Plummer, who worked on the OS. Previously, engineers were supposed to use these daily builds to get a feel for what they were actually building. That became increasingly impossible. Taking a look at some of the spring 2004 builds of Longhorn, you can really start to see the project collapsing under its own weight. Even the most stable of these builds is a barely functional wreck, and Microsoft knew it. Jim Olchin bluntly wrote in a January 2004 memo, "Longhorn is a pig and I don't see a solution to this." Something had to give, and so in August 2004, the decision was made by Olchin and his boss Bill Gates to pull the plug on Longhorn. The project was jettisoned, ending 3 years of development hell. Work on the next big version of Windows was reset and started over, using the faster, cleaner codebase of Windows Server 2003 that had been forked all the way back right after the launch of Windows 2000. And with it came a new name. The Windows Vista moniker was officially announced to the public in July 2005. Vista signifying the visual feast of this new UI. The Great Longhorn Reset came with some significant casualties. Performance-hungry features like WinFS, the database-like file system, were junked. Instead, Windows File Search would be improved through use of indexing and metadata. And ambitions around porting key apps to .NET were also scaled back. But the planned translucent UI, later seen in some Longhorn builds, was salvaged and revamped into Aero, with a new focus on performance eventually becoming a central feature in Vista's marketing. And Microsoft shifted towards much stricter build management to avoid a repeat of the disarray that plagued those latter-day Longhorn builds. No more checking in code willy-nilly, not knowing whether it'd break another team's work. Eventually, public beta builds throughout 2006 started to gain a positive reception among pros and enthusiasts, a promising sign following a protracted and fraught development cycle. Post-reset Vista builds looked more restrained and consistent than the various incarnations of Longhorn that leaked out between 2002 and 2004. And throughout those later Vista betas, key features started coming into focus. Aero Glass, the much hyped translucent 3D UI, was very much a product of its time aesthetically, but it also was kind of a breath of fresh air after 5 years of the Fisher-Price Luna design language of XP with its bubbly buttons and saturated blues and greens. Glassy window borders with a pixel shader blur effect, along with 3D window animations, contributed to a UI that seemed for 2006 impressively futuristic. The new sidebar, a distant ancestor of the current Windows 11 notification bar, brought greater functionality to the desktop with interactive widgets. The new Explorer made navigation easier and prettier with breadcrumb navigation and improved search. User account control, while later derided for its intrusiveness, was an important step in securing Windows against some of the malware threats that had plagued XP, and Windows Defender was an early step in giving Windows OS-level protection against bad apps. And hey, how about that? Vista was actually the first version to ship with BitLocker for improved storage security, though this was only available in its Enterprise and Ultimate editions. What emerged out of the reset was much more than just a shell of the old Windows Longhorn. It was a far better product than Longhorn could have ever hoped to have been. That's a fun little factoid to dwell on given Vista's toxic reputation. It is viewed as one of the worst versions of Windows, and yet what we actually got, I'd argue, is the good timeline version of this OS. Because if the reset didn't happen and Microsoft had just kept going with the old Longhorn codebase, what eventually launched would have unquestionably have been much, much worse. Yet, as we all know, Vista's big debut wasn't exactly smooth. The problem wasn't just what Vista was, it was how it ran, what it broke, and when it arrived.
Well, we say the wow starts now. It's kind of time to launch this product, though. Kids, on the count of 3, ready? We'll push the wow starts now button and launch Windows Vista. What do you think? 1, 2, 3, go! Yeah!
Microsoft wrapped up Windows Vista development in November 2006 and released it to the public on January 30th, 2007. Early reviews were mainly positive, with many praising Vista's new look and pointing out just how much of an under-the-hood technical overhaul it was compared to XP. The thing is though, many of those people in the tech press were running Vista on what were at the time cutting-edge high-end PCs. I did the same back in the day on my trusty Athlon 64 rig. On a decently spec'd mid-2000s gaming PC, Vista could absolutely fly. The real problems began when regular XP users upgraded and found Vista was often slower and clunkier than they were used to. And in a lot of ways, Vista was just a weightier OS with higher system requirements. It did more, and so it needed more power, no getting around that. Because of the uniquely long wait for Vista, Windows XP had gotten better and better with 2 service packs in the time it took Vista to come out, while remaining a much lighter weight OS with lower system requirements rooted in the tech of the late 90s. By the time Vista launched, XP was 5 years old, and all but the wheeziest netbook CPUs and crusty 90s era beige boxers could run it effortlessly. But also, the perception of Vista as bloated and slow wasn't entirely fair. In the new OS, the mantra of free RAM is wasted RAM was central to how Windows used memory. When the system had a good chunk of RAM to spare, a new feature called Superfetch would preload apps and data proactively to speed up loading times. That's a good thing. But when users looked in Task Manager, all they saw was Vista using more RAM when idling compared to the same PC running XP. Microsoft also made DirectX 10, its next-gen APIs for 3D games, exclusive to Windows Vista, leading to angry forum posts from many gamers who saw it as a ploy to force upgrades. The truth is a little more complex. DX10 relied heavily on the new Windows display driver model built for Vista, which was a complete rewrite of the old XP driver model. In theory, Microsoft could have ported everything back to XP, but it'd be an enormous technical workload for an outcome that was against its commercial interests. Not much chance of that happening then. What's more, in early versions of Vista with early drivers, some games would indeed run slower on the new OS than XP. Usually not by a lot, but if you're a gamer and your top priority is squeezing as many frames as possible from your rig, suddenly a Vista upgrade is a tough sell. It would take a few more years for any titles to emerge where DX10 actually made much of a difference to how games looked or played. Crysis, for example, looked basically identical whether you were running it in DX9 on XP or DX10 on Vista, all of which didn't do much to drive gamer adoption of the new OS. In fact, that new driver model played a big part in early teething issues for Vista. Drivers for everything had to be rewritten. Vista couldn't use older drivers written for Windows XP. And as manufacturers rushed to build Vista drivers for their devices in this new and unfamiliar format, it was inevitable that bugs and performance issues would creep in. If you ever experienced weird hardware problems that affected Vista but not XP, well, now you know why. UAC, not that one, was another major pain point. The feature itself was a good thing, building on the painful lessons learned with XP's lack of security in its early days. UAC blocked off potentially harmful functions of apps requiring a confirmatory click to continue. The way it was implemented in Vista, though, was widely seen as obnoxious and overbearing, with the pop-up taking over your screen and dimming your apps in the background. UAC was one of a handful of features that Apple capitalized on in its famous Mac versus PC ads. Apple was nearing the peak of its redemption arc in 2007, so these ads only played into the idea of Microsoft as this stodgy, blundering incumbent, and Apple's Macs as the clean, cool computers of the future.
He's part of Vista, my new operating system.
He asked me to authorize pretty much anything I do.
Apple also dunked on Vista's often confounding array of different versions. You had 6 main editions: Starter, Home Basic, Home Premium, Business, Enterprise, and Ultimate, each with distinct, not always overlapping feature sets. It felt less like picking an OS and more like speccing out a character class in the world's most tedious RPG. The Big Daddy Vista Ultimate Edition is worth touching on briefly though, because it included some neat Ultimate extras that filled the same role as Microsoft Plus did for older OSs. There were new sounds and visuals, of course, plus the debut of BitLocker encryption, now standard in Pro versions of Windows. Another was Windows Dream Scene, an early take on live wallpapers that brought glowy, soothing animated backgrounds to your desktop, though you would need a pretty beefy mid-2000s PC to enjoy this without a performance hit. At the other end of the spectrum was Vista Home Basic, the Scrubs version of Windows that didn't even include the new Aero Glass interface, and that version was actually at the center of a major Vista controversy. In the year before the OS shipped, Microsoft allowed PC manufacturers to label XP machines as Vista capable. However, many of these were only capable of running Vista Home Basic without Aero Glass and a bunch of other features. Intel's GMA 915 was one common graphics chip that became notorious for being Vista capable on paper while not being able to run the full-fat Vista UI. This blew up into a massive class action lawsuit in 2008, during which damaging internal emails emerged suggesting key people at Microsoft knew the whole Vista capable shtick would be misleading. Even without all this drama though, the fact that Windows XP was good enough and so entrenched in the digital lives of many of us in the mid-2000s meant that any effort to get people off the blue and green behemoth would have been quite the undertaking. In the end though, driver teething issues, performance regressions for upgraders, and the various memeable Vista pitfalls led to a tanking reputation for this new OS, the exact opposite of what Microsoft needed to wean people off of XP. Microsoft was losing the messaging battle fast, and Vista was becoming a punchline. So tarnished was the OS's reputation by mid-2008 that Microsoft hit back with a new ad campaign, Project Mojave. In the guise of a focus group, Microsoft first got volunteers to rate their opinions of Windows Vista, then preview a new secret version of Windows Mojave, and rate that. The twist of course being that Mojave didn't exist, they'd been happily using Vista all along.
Are you serious?
This is Windows Vista.
Son of a gun.
And sure, these reactions were likely cherry-picked, and the Vista experience on offer on specially selected high-end laptops would have been vastly superior to someone, say, upgrading to Vista Home Basic on a Pentium-powered potato. But still, they underscored how even people who hadn't used it knew Vista sucked, or thought they knew.
It's horrible, we have so many problems.
It crashes.
The Vista hate had gone mainstream. Tech News headlines reported PC makers and buyers reverting back to the tried and true Windows XP. Demand for XP downgrades from business users was strong. And as well as the aforementioned Mac versus PC ads that Apple had been running, mockery of the OS was breaking out into mainstream popular culture.
Maybe if you weren't so distracted by sick children in Africa, you could have put a little more thought into Windows Vista.
What kind of operating system does it use?
It's,
Vista!
We're going to die!
So if you're Microsoft, how do you dig yourself out of this hole? A big player in this effort in the immediate aftermath of Vista's completion was this guy, Steven Sinofsky. Sinofsky took over as SVP of Windows in summer 2006, right before Vista's completion, but had minimal involvement with the actual development. And he prioritized compatibility and performance fixes for Vista Service Pack 1, which shipped in 2008. This first major maintenance release addressed driver issues and boosted performance, made UAC less obnoxious, and fixed bugs across the board. Further improvements followed in Service Pack 2, released in 2009. But Vista's improvement throughout 2008 and into 2009 in many ways had to do with a lot of external factors. In the time since launch, component and peripheral makers were finally getting to grips with Vista's new driver model. PC hardware was getting faster too, with multi-core 64-bit CPUs and DirectX 10 GPUs becoming more mainstream. And RAM prices came down significantly, making a baseline 2GB of memory, about the minimum for a comfortable Vista experience, much more affordable in early 2009 than it was in 2007. None of that had anything to do with Microsoft, but nevertheless, it improved the quality of the Vista experience someone on a typical PC could have. The ecosystem had caught up to Vista, just as Vista itself had improved. Microsoft had flirted with bigger, more experimental ideas for Vista's successor, originally codenamed Vienna. Concepts like gesture controls and removing the start menu were allegedly floated, ideas that eventually made it into Windows 8. But Vista's rocky reception forced a focus back on the fundamentals. Windows 7, announced in mid-2007 and launched in fall 2009, was widely seen as what Vista should have been. But Microsoft knew that the Windows Vista brand was fatally damaged, hence the jump to the cleaner numeric branding. The internal version number though, funnily enough, was actually Windows 6.1, Vista having been 6.0, which tells you all you need to know about how Windows 7 wasn't such a huge reinvention after all. The taskbar got a new look, with grouped app icons to cut down on clutter, multi-touch and high-density display support was added, and the widget sidebar was retired in favour of widgets being able to live freely on the Windows desktop. Under the leadership of Steven Sinofsky, Windows 7's development was much more disciplined, and Microsoft avoided the pitfalls that had plagued early Vista and Longhorn development. In his retrospective writings, he described seeing steady progress in the daily builds of Windows 7 that the team were producing, in stark contrast to the old Windows Longhorn, where those builds sometimes wouldn't even boot. Windows 7 built on the work started in Vista's service packs, improving boot times and reducing memory footprints further, leading to a leaner, more polished OS that to this day is still remembered by many as the best version of Windows. Ironic then that under the hood it's not all that different to Service Pack 2 of the OS everyone seemed to hate. Despite popular perceptions, Windows Vista was actually a success sales-wise. It sold 40 million units in its first 100 days, outpacing Windows XP in the same period after its release. Still, it couldn't dislodge XP, and the reputational damage it did to Windows at the time was tangible. 2 years on from launch, Vista stood at just under 24% market share to XP's 62%. It would take Windows 7 another 2 years to finally edge past XP to take the lion's share of the PC market. Vista started out as Windows Longhorn, being built on shaky foundations under development processes seemingly held together with duct tape and spider webs. Those foundations and that process couldn't handle the project's ballooning ambitions, leading to the whole thing imploding and a dev reset that led to the Windows Vista we know today. It was a crucial milestone for Windows as it entered the age of the social internet, giving us features like UAC that are still around today, WDDM which still underpins graphics drivers for Windows 11, Windows Search with indexing, BitLocker, Superfetch, Defender, the list goes on. 18 years later, Vista is remembered as one of the worst versions of Windows, right up there with the hated Windows Me. Whether that's fair depends on your own personal experience of the OS. I mainly used it on specky gaming PCs and reasonably quick laptops and it ran great. But if your time with Vista involved it barging in and ruining an otherwise functional XP machine with slow performance and annoying pop-ups, then I get it, you're absolutely justified in your acrimony. There certainly were enough people in that boat for Vista to become the unfortunate joke that it is today. Vista was pitched as the bright, shimmery, translucent future of Windows, but it wasn't the future for long. Within the first few months, it was clear this was a troubled product with a tarnished reputation, and within a couple of years, enthusiasts were already looking ahead to Windows 7. But if you think about it, the role that Vista ended up playing wasn't so different from what Longhorn was originally meant to be, a rest stop on the road to something bigger. Microsoft had to trip and stumble with Vista to arrive at the more polished and confident Windows 7, and maybe that makes it all worthwhile. If you used Windows Vista back in the day, and let's face it, you've made it to the end of this video, so chances are you did, then share your memories, good or bad, down in the comments, and let me know which iconic software or hardware you'd love to revisit next. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Good old Vista. People give it a bad press, but I'm never upgrading. Why would I? It just feels like a good pair of jeans.